Hello, and welcome to another week of Adult Sunday School here at Holy Cross Lutheran Church. We are continuing our journey through the book of Acts as we follow the followers of Jesus after Jesus' ascension. We are this week in the second half of Acts chapter 21 and most of Acts chapter 22. Last week, we followed Paul as he went back to Jerusalem after his second jaunt all around the Mediterranean. Everyone was warning him not to go to Jerusalem because he was going to get arrested and some other bad things were probably going to happen to him. But he went anyways because he knew that he was going to preach the gospel. And he didn't really care what happened to him as long as the gospel was preached. So Paul gets to Jerusalem and he has to do this strange 7-day long purification ritual because there were rumors that Paul was no longer a Jew. There were rumors that he was teaching things about how the law was bad and that people didn't need to follow the law anymore. And so this purification ritual was kind of was supposed to wash the Gentile off of Paul. Early Christians in Jerusalem were still very much Jewish. They still followed the law. They still did all of those Jewish things. And it wasn't really until quite a bit later, after some influence of Paul, and as more Gentiles came into the church, that Christianity started to become something radically different from Judaism. And I mean, now they're essentially two very separate religions. This purification ritual, of course, was supposed to fix everything, according to the leaders of the church in Jerusalem. It was going to send a message that Paul did, in fact, care about these Jewish things still, and he was still a Jew. Well, let's just say it didn't fix anything, and everything that was prophesied about Paul going to Jerusalem happened. So let's jump in with Acts 21, starting at verse 27. When the 7 days of purification were almost over, the Jews from the province of Asia saw Paul in the temple. Grabbing him, they threw the whole crowd into confusion by shouting, "Fellow Israelites, help! This is the man who teaches everyone everywhere against our people, the law, and this place. Not only that, he has even brought Greeks into the temple and defiled this holy place." They said this because they had seen Trophimus the Ephesian in the city with him earlier, and they assumed Paul had brought him into the temple. I really feel bad for poor Trophimus the Ephesian because all of this gets started because one group of people saw a set of things and interpreted it completely wrongly, and then started spreading the lie that Paul brought a Gentile into the temple. This is not something that Paul did. And really, Paul didn't exactly seem to be teaching against the Jews, the law, and the temple. Now, of course, you can take the things that Paul teaches in an incredibly anti-Semitic way, and we know this because historically Christians have unfortunately taken many of the things that Paul said in an incredibly anti-Semitic way. All of this is it's a riot based on a misunderstanding. And it was a riot that this purification ritual that Paul took was supposed to fix, only apparently didn't. So Paul is seized now by a riotous mob, stirred up by some Jews from the province of Asia, but not a good situation. So what happens next? The entire city was stirred up. The people came rushing, seized Paul, and dragged him out of the temple. Immediately the gates were closed. While they were trying to kill him, a report reached the commander of a company of soldiers that all Jerusalem was in a state of confusion. Without a moment's hesitation, he took some soldiers and officers and ran down to the mob. When the mob saw the commander and his soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. So this riot that starts out as kind of a localized incident around the temple turns into a citywide event, leading to the closing of the gates of the city and the deployment of the Roman garrison. The commander of a force of anywhere between 360 and 1,000 soldiers, probably closer to about 480. It's whatever 6 times 80 is. I can't do the math right now in my head, and I forgot to write it down. But this group is called a cohort. It's kind of the second tier of Roman military organization. First is, well, there's a maniple and then a century and then a cohort. So I guess it's the third tier. But this is a fairly good sized force of a good number of soldiers, especially in this time. And the commander of the garrison sends soldiers to break up the riot. I mean, unfortunately, riots happened a lot in first century Judea. The Jewish people really did not like their Roman occupiers. And so they rioted a lot. There's a lot of historical evidence for a lot of riots. And conveniently for Paul, when the soldiers show up, the mob stops trying to kill him, which is kind of a nice thing. Not so nice that they were trying to kill him in the first place, but it's nice that they stopped when the soldiers showed up. So moving on, verse 33. When the commander arrived, he arrested Paul and ordered him to be bound with 2 chains. Only then did he begin to ask who Paul was and what he had done. Some in the crowd shouted one thing, others shouted something else. Because of the commotion, he couldn't learn the truth, so he ordered that Paul be taken to the military headquarters. When Paul reached the steps, he had to be carried by the soldiers in order to protect him from the violence of the crowd. The mob that followed kept screaming, "Away with him!" So here we have Claudius Lysias, who is the commander of this group. We find out his name later in Acts 23, verse 26. And his official rank is cohort tribune. This is kind of a higher rank than a centurion, for instance, would be, and fairly high ranking in whatever group of soldiers was stationed in Jerusalem. He had access to a lot of things. So this is a kind of important guy. And this riot is getting so bad now that he takes Paul into the garrison. The Tower of Antonia is what it's called. It's named after Mark Antony of Antony and Cleopatra fame, as, well as all that other stuff that he did. But all the while, the mob is yelling and screaming so much that Lysias can't figure out who Paul is and what he's done. Now, some people are saying one thing, other people are saying another thing, but the mob is violent because in their minds, the inciting incident was that Paul broke one of the gravest taboos in Judaism by bringing a Gentile into the temple. Now, it doesn't matter that Paul didn't do this, of course. They don't really care about the truth at this point. They just only know their anger. And so, Commander's like, okay, I got to figure out who this guy is and why everyone is so mad at him. So, verse 37. As Paul was about to be taken into the military headquarters, he asked the commander, "May I speak with you?" He answered, "Do you know Greek? Aren't you the Egyptian who started a revolt and led 4,000 terrorists into the desert some time ago?" Paul replied, "I'm a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of an important city. Please let me speak to the people." So the commander is confused because apparently he thought Paul was a terrorist. And that was the reason why the riot happened. Specifically, he thought Paul was this one terrorist named the Egyptian. Now, the Egyptian gets a mention in Josephus's works. This is what he says. "There was an Egyptian false prophet that did the Jews more mischief than the former, for he was a cheat and pretended to be a prophet also, and got together 30,000 men that were deluded by him. These he led round about from the wilderness to the mount which was called the Mount of Olives. He was ready to break into Jerusalem by force from that place, and if he could but once conquer the Roman garrison and the people, he intended to rule them by the assistance of those guards of his that were to break into the city with him. So this is a guy who kind of sounds like he's setting himself up a little bit to look like Jesus. This epic entry into Jerusalem from the Mount of Olives, but kind of an anti-Jesus. And this revolt by the Egyptian is put down by a guy named Antonius Felix. Felix is someone that we will meet in 2 weeks because Paul actually ends up on trial before him. And he is the procurator of Judea. It seems like he kind of took what once was Pilate's role. And Felix didn't actually catch the Egyptian when he put down the Egyptian's revolt. Instead, the Egyptian fled into the wilderness and was never really seen again. So Commander Lysias thought that because of the epic riot, Paul was the Egyptian, this guy that he had been looking for, which is probably why the guy Lysias is so confused that Paul spoke Greek, because while it's not uncommon to speak Greek, apparently the Egyptian didn't. And so Lysias is like, wait, who are you again? And Paul says, well, I'm just a Jewish guy from Tarsus. Let me talk to the folk. So Paul's about to talk to the folk. With the commander's permission, Paul stood on the steps and gestured to the people. When they were quiet, he addressed them in Aramaic. Brothers and fathers, listen now to my defense. When they heard him address them in Aramaic, they became even more quiet. So I don't know what the mob thought of Paul at this point, but Paul stands up before everyone and speaks in Aramaic, and he is going to tell his life story to the crowd, which almost works until at the very end he says a very specific thing that really ticks people off. So here goes. Let's find out Paul's life story. Paul continued, I'm a Jew born in Tarsus in Cilicia, but raised in this city. Under Gamaliel's instruction, I was trained in the strict interpretation of our ancestral law. I do want to stop right here real fast because Gamaliel, if you remember, was in Acts chapter 5. He was the one who said of followers of Jesus, if this thing that they're doing is not from God, it's going to go away. But if this thing is from God, then nothing will be able to stop it. So just wanted to remind you that that's who Gamaliel is. And if you want to read more about what Gamaliel said about what became Christianity, go back to the episode on Acts chapter 5. So anyways, back to Paul's speech. I am passionately loyal to God, just like you who are gathered here today. I harassed those who followed this way to their death, arresting and delivering both men and women into prison. The high priest and the whole Jerusalem council can testify about me. I received letters from them addressed to our associates in Damascus, then went there to bring those who were arrested to Jerusalem so they could be punished. During that journey, at about noon, as I approached Damascus, suddenly a bright light from heaven encircled me. I fell to the ground and heard a voice asking me, Saul, Saul, why are you harassing me? I answered, Who are you, Lord? I am Jesus the Nazarene, whom you are harassing, he replied. My traveling companions saw the light, but they didn't hear the voice of the one who spoke to me. I asked, What should I do, Lord? Get up, the Lord replied, and go into Damascus. There you will be told everything you have been appointed to do. I couldn't see because of the brightness of that light, so my companions led me by the hand into Damascus. There was a certain man named Ananias. According to the standards of the law, he was a pious man who enjoyed the respect of all the Jews living there. He came and stood beside me. Brother Saul, receive your sight, he said. Instantly I regained my sight and I could see him. He said, The God of our ancestors has selected you to know his will, to see the righteous one, and to hear his voice. You will be his witness to everyone concerning what you have seen and heard. What are you waiting for? Get up, be baptized, and wash away your sins as you call on his name. When I returned to Jerusalem and was praying in the temple, I had a visionary experience. I saw the Lord speaking to me. Hurry, he said. Leave Jerusalem at once, because they won't accept your testimony about me. I responded, Lord, these people know I used to go from one synagogue to the next, beating those who believe in you and throwing them into prison. When Stephen, your witness, was being killed, I stood there giving my approval, even watching the clothes that belonged to those who were killing him. Then the Lord said to me, Go, I will send you far away to the Gentiles. The crowd listened to Paul until he said this. So Paul is telling, he's telling the story that we've been hearing for a while, that, the story of him persecuting Christians, meeting God on the road to Damascus, getting healed by Ananias. He adds in this little detail about a vision that he had in Jerusalem that led to him going out into the world. But this is all stuff that we've heard before. It's all stuff that we know. And the people are kind of following along with it too. They're okay with the things that Paul is saying. Sure, they're not probably too happy that he thinks that this Jesus guy is the Messiah, but so far they're with him. They're following him. They're down with what he's saying until he gets to the end. And he says that the Lord told him, Go, I will send you far away to the Gentiles. Because all of a sudden, everything changes. The crowd was listening until he said that. And this brings up a problem that we often face. It's what I preached about last week a little bit, that God is for outsiders. And this is a problem that comes up a lot. And it's something that we still don't exactly like hearing today. When Jesus said something similar in Luke chapter 4, this is, it didn't go well. The people basically started a riot and tried to throw him off a cliff. But God loves reminding us that he loves people outside of his follower group as much as he loves his followers. And God really, really, really wants his followers to love those outside his followers like he does. But we're not all that good at it. So when the crowd hears that Paul has been sent to the Gentiles, the outsiders, they're not happy. Not the stuff that Jesus, it's not the stuff about Jesus that set them off. No, it's the stuff about the Gentiles. And remember that the reason why the riot is happening is because they bought a lie that Paul had brought a Gentile into the temple. So the crowd is not happy. Let's see what they do. Then they shouted, Away with this man, he's not fit to live. As they were screaming, throwing off their garments, and flinging dust into the air, the commander directed that Paul be taken into the military headquarters. He ordered that Paul be questioned under the whip so that he could find out why they were shouting at him like this. So the commander takes Paul out of the situation and is going to, question him under the whip. Which is exactly what it sounds like is going to happen. But we know something that the commander doesn't know. Paul is a Roman citizen. And Paul, because he's a Roman citizen, can't be beaten for no reason. He has to be convicted of something first. So things are about to get a little bit interesting. Yes, let's use the word interesting. So, verse 25, as they were stretching him out and tying him down with straps, Paul said to the centurion standing there, Can you legally whip a Roman citizen who hasn't been found guilty in court? When the centurion heard this, he went to the commander and reported it. He asked, What are you about to do? This man is a Roman citizen. The commander went to Paul and demanded, Tell me, are you a Roman citizen? He said, Yes. The commander replied, It cost me a lot of money to buy my citizenship. Paul said, I'm a citizen by birth. And at once those who were about to examine him stepped away. The commander was alarmed when he realized he had bound a Roman citizen. So Paul is getting tied up, ready to be whipped and beaten by the Roman soldiers. And just kind of casual like he goes, so is it legal to whip a Roman citizen that hasn't been convicted first? And the entire garrison goes, oh, now they really should be thanking Paul here because Paul did just save them a whole lot of headache. But the centurion in charge of beating Paul runs to the commander and says, boss, we got a problem. This guy says he's a Roman citizen. So the commander then went to Paul and says, are you in fact a Roman citizen? And Paul says, yes. And then the commander says something a little bit odd. He says, it cost me a lot of money to buy my citizenship. Now, seems like a weird exchange, but I think it's only weird because we don't fully understand. We're not quite sure why Claudius Lysias had to buy his citizenship. We don't know if he's meaning like, I bought it by doing military service, because that's one way to get citizenship. But the one I think that happened is he gave a gift to Emperor Claudius, hence the name Claudius Lysias, and in giving a gift to the emperor gave him both his citizenship and his position as the commander of the garrison. In part because Emperor Claudius was known for doing that kind of thing. And so the commander's looking at Paul, seeing this kind of scruffy guy who does not look like he can afford things, says, really? You're a citizen? With what I paid to get my citizenship, you're a citizen? You scruffy little leather worker? But Paul replies, no, I was born a citizen. And now that tells us some things about Paul. It means that either his parents or an ancestor was probably from a group of Jewish slaves that was taken when Pompey conquered Jerusalem in 63 BC. It's also possible that they were in the military, but given Paul's occupation, it's not likely that they were wealthy enough to buy citizenship. But one of the ways to get citizenship is either through military service or by being a slave who has been freed. So not only is Paul a citizen, but he comes from a family that has had citizenship for at least long enough for him to be born a citizen, which means something to Romans, because that changes your class status, which is probably why everyone backed away from Paul, because they're going, oh, I don't want anything to do with this situation. Because Paul is basically claiming that, at least when it comes to citizenship status, he actually ranks a little bit better than their commander. The commander who had to buy citizenship, but Paul just had it. His family has citizenship. And so there's a lot that's happening here. Now, I do want to address that some people do think that Paul was falsely claiming citizenship. But if he was, and at any point he's found out, that's pretty much instant death. Like, there's not a lot. If you found that you are claiming citizenship falsely, they don't really put up with that. The penalties are incredibly harsh. And there are a lot of opportunities in the next several chapters for Paul to have been found out. And while, yes, I mean, there is a chance that, Paul is falsely claiming citizenship and God is protecting him, I don't really think that's the case, because it never actually comes up. I mean, Paul's going to basically appeal his case all the way to Caesar. And at some point, someone's going to check and make sure that this guy is who he says he is. And Romans had a really pretty good bureaucracy. They would be able to find out if Paul was a citizen or not. And so in these next 6 chapters of Acts, there are a ton of opportunities for Paul to be found out if he was falsely claiming citizenship, which leads me to believe that he actually was what he said he was. And so now things are really going to change in the way that Paul interacts with Lysias and interacts with the rest of the Roman community. And it's the Roman community that he's primarily going to be interacting with from now on. But first, Lysias, who is still very confused now, even more confused because why is this Roman citizen in the middle of a Jewish riot? So Lysias arranges for the Sanhedrin to meet, and they and Paul discuss the accusations against him. And in doing so, Paul manages to make the whole Sanhedrin mad enough to kill him. And that is what we will get into next week. So thank you for joining us for this journey through the book of Acts. If you've got any questions on what we talked about today or want to add to the discussion, leave a comment down below in the comment section, and I will do my best to reply to you. And until next week, I hope you have a wonderful week, and God bless.